Right now, 4 million barrels of oil are crossing the ocean every single day on ships that officially do not exist. They sail without recognizable insurance. Their ownership chains vanish into shell companies. Their transponders go dark at sea. On paper, these ships are invisible. In reality, they are moving the energy supply of half the world. This is not a loophole. It is a parallel system. Western sanctions were designed to be airtight. They were built to choke revenue, isolate Russia, and force economic collapse without firing a shot. What actually happened was the opposite. A logistics machine emerged that rendered the sanctions irrelevant while maintaining full deniability. This machine is called the Ghost Fleet. It does not challenge navies. It does not violate borders. It does not announce itself. It simply moves oil. Crude leaves Russian ports and disappears into open water. Ownership changes mid-voyage through paper transfers. Cargoes are blended, relabeled, and rerouted. Tankers dock in neutral ports. The oil is refined in third countries. It re-enters global markets under a different flag, a different invoice, and a different story. By the time it reaches Europe, it is no longer Russian oil. On paper, this is the shock most people miss. Sanctions were never defeated by force. They were defeated by logistics. The most aggressive economic warfare regime in modern history was bypassed not by governments, but by traders, ship owners, insurers, and refiners responding to profit and necessity. The scale matters. Millions of barrels per day do not move accidentally. This is not smuggling at the margins. This is industrial scale evasion. Entire fleets have been repurposed. Old tankers were purchased quietly. Flags of convenience multiplied. Insurance was replaced with private guarantees. Risk was absorbed because the margins were large enough to justify it. The West believed control lived in paperwork. Reality lives in ships, ports, and refineries. This is why the Ghost Fleet represents more than an oil story. It exposes a structural weakness in how modern power is exercised. Sanctions assume compliance. Compliance assumes legitimacy. Legitimacy dissolves when the cost of obedience exceeds the cost of evasion. That threshold was crossed. Once crossed, enforcement becomes symbolic. Rules remain, statements continue, press conferences repeat, but the system they are meant to control roots around them automatically. No command is required. The mechanism activates on its own. This is stage 4 behavior. When formal systems lose the ability to enforce outcomes, informal systems take over. They do not ask permission. They do not require consensus. They follow demand. The Ghost Fleet did not defeat the U.S. Navy by sinking ships. It defeated sanctions by proving that paper power cannot stop physical trade. And once that truth is exposed, it cannot be unseen. The pattern. Blockades always fail. Every blockade in history begins with confidence and ends with evasion. The logic is always the same. If control can be asserted on paper, reality will comply. This belief has never survived contact with demand. Blockades fail not because they are poorly designed, but because they misunderstand how trade actually functions. Trade is not ideological. It is not loyal. It does not respond to declarations. It responds to necessity and profit. When those forces collide with restriction, restriction loses. This pattern is ancient. First, a dominant power imposes rules. It controls ports, finance, insurance, and access. On paper, the system is closed. Compliance is assumed because the penalties are severe. Early results appear successful. Official flows decline. Headlines declare victory. Then the mechanism activates. Demand remains. Energy is still required. Food must still move. Industry does not pause because rules change. When the price signal rises, that signal invites workarounds. Routes fragment, ownership obscures, middlemen multiply. What was once visible becomes distributed. At this stage, enforcement still exists, but it is chasing shadows. The dominant power responds by tightening controls. Documentation increases. Reporting requirements expand. Sanctions lists grow longer. Each layer adds friction. But friction does not stop trade. It only changes its shape. This is where blockades fail structurally. Trade migrates from the official layer to the physical layer, from regulated corridors to informal networks, from transparent markets to opaque ones. The system does not break. It adapts. The final phase arrives when the dominant power realizes enforcement costs exceed impact. At that point, the blockade continues rhetorically but collapses functionally. Everyone knows it is being bypassed. No one can stop it without escalating to direct force. That escalation rarely happens because the cost is too high. This is why sanctions regimes persist long after they stop working. They are no longer tools of control. They are signals of intent. Reality has already moved on. The Ghost Fleet is not an innovation. It is a historical constant expressed with modern technology. AIS manipulation replaces false papers. Shell companies replace front merchants. Offshore insurance replaces state-backed coverage. The tools change. The outcome does not. Blockades assume compliance is rational. History shows evasion is inevitable. Once a system reaches this stage, reversal is mathematically impossible without abandoning the blockade entirely or escalating into open conflict. Neither option restores control. One admits failure, The other destroys the system imposing it. This is the pattern repeating. Rules are written, trade adapts, control dissolves. And when paper systems fail to enforce reality, physical networks take over permanently. That is not a prediction. It is history asserting itself. Historical proof: the Continental Blockade, 1806. The Ghost Fleet looks modern, but the mechanism behind it is ancient. It first revealed itself clearly during the Napoleonic Wars, when Europe's most powerful empire attempted to control trade through law, force, and paperwork, and discovered that demand always defeats decree. Napoleon Bonaparte called his strategy the Continental System. History remembers it as one of the clearest demonstrations of why blockades collapse from the inside. In 1806, Napoleon faced a strategic problem he could not solve militarily. Britain controlled the seas. The Royal Navy made invasion impossible. Unable to defeat Britain by force, Napoleon attempted something more ambitious: economic strangulation. Through the Berlin Decree, all British goods were banned from continental Europe. Ports were closed. Trade was criminalized. Any ship that touched Britain was declared hostile. On paper, it was total control. Napoleon believed that control of territory meant control of commerce. Europe's ports, customs houses, and armies were under his influence. If laws were written tightly enough and enforcement was harsh enough, trade would stop. Britain, deprived of markets, would collapse financially and politically. For a brief moment, the numbers appeared to confirm his belief. Official British exports to Europe declined. Port records showed reduced traffic. Seizures were publicized. Reports sent to Paris described compliance. This is the early phase of every sanctions regime. Clean data, visible enforcement, and political confidence. The system looks effective because only official channels are measured. But demand did not disappear. Europe still required textiles, coal, sugar, coffee, and manufactured goods. Merchants still needed margins. Consumers still wanted access. As legal supply vanished, prices rose. And as prices rose, opportunity appeared. What began as small-scale smuggling rapidly transformed into an industrial operation. This is where the mechanism activates. British goods began entering Europe through neutral ports. Cargoes were unloaded in Scandinavia, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Balkans, then moved inland through informal routes. Ships changed flags mid-journey. Manifests were rewritten. Ownership transferred through intermediaries. Front companies emerged to disguise origin. Customs officials were bribed or quietly ignored violations to protect local economies. The blockade did not suppress trade. It restructured it. The more Napoleon tightened enforcement, the more profitable evasion became. Each new decree increased margins for smugglers. Risk premiums rose, attracting better organization, better ships, and better networks. Smuggling stopped being criminal improvisation and became professional logistics. By 1809, the continental system was failing openly. British goods flooded European markets under neutral labels. Entire regions depended on illicit trade for survival. Local elites protected smuggling networks because enforcement damaged their own revenues. The blockade began harming Europe more than Britain. Shortages spread, prices surged, public resentment grew. Napoleon responded as all sanctioning powers do in Stage 4, with escalation. More inspections, more decrees, more punishments, more military pressure on allies. Each step increased enforcement costs while reducing compliance. The blockade shifted from an economic weapon into a political liability. Napoleon found himself policing his own allies, invading neutral territories, and diverting military resources just to maintain the illusion of control. This is the critical point in every blockade's life cycle. Once enforcement costs exceed strategic benefit, control is lost, even if the rules remain. Napoleon continued to proclaim the continental system long after it had collapsed functionally. The law survived. Compliance did not. Britain never collapsed. Instead, France weakened. The continental blockade damaged European economies, alienated allies, fueled corruption, and eroded legitimacy. It forced Napoleon into increasingly aggressive actions to preserve authority, including the disastrous invasion of Russia. The attempt to control trade through decree accelerated imperial decline rather than preventing it. This is the lesson modern systems refuse to learn. Blockades do not fail because the target is strong. They fail because trade is physical, not ideological. No law can override the incentive to move goods when demand exists and profit compensates risk. Decrees operate on paper. Trade operates through ships, ports, warehouses, and refineries. When the two collide, paper yields. The Ghost Fleet is the modern expression of this same mechanism. Western sanctions against Russia were constructed with identical assumptions. Control finance, insurance, ports, and documentation, and trade will stop. For a short period, official data suggested success. Russian exports dipped. Headlines celebrated isolation. Compliance appeared measurable, but oil demand did not vanish. Energy is not discretionary. Industry does not pause for moral alignment. When restrictions collided with necessity, prices rose. That price signal summoned an alternative network, just as it did 2 centuries earlier. Old tankers were purchased quietly. Ownership was buried under layers of shell companies. Flags of convenience replaced national registries. AIS transponders went dark at sea. Insurance was replaced with private guarantees. Cargoes were blended, relabeled, and rerouted. Refining shifted to intermediaries. On paper, compliance existed. In reality, oil flowed uninterrupted. Just as British goods entered Napoleonic Europe as neutral cargo, Russian oil re-enters global markets as non-Russian fuel. The label changes. The substance does not. Enforcement chases documentation, while physical supply chains operate independently. Napoleon eventually understood the truth too late. Blockades collapse the enforcer before they collapse the target. They hollow out legitimacy, inflate enforcement costs, and force overreach. The system survives rhetorically while failing materially. This is stage 4 behavior. In stage 4, systems do not break publicly. They empty, rules remain, institutions remain. But compliance becomes optional because the physical network no longer depends on permission. Control shifts from law to logistics. The ghost fleet did not appear because someone engineered a clever loophole. It appeared because the system demanded it. Once demand creates a parallel structure, dismantling it without destroying a global trade becomes mathematically impossible. That is not speculation. It is the same conclusion Napoleon reached after years of denial. Paper power can declare. Physical trade decides. That rule has never changed, and it is operating now at global scale. The trap. Today, sanctions as theater. The modern trap is believing sanctions still function as instruments of control. They no longer do. They function as theater, a visible performance of authority masking a loss of settlement power. The ghost fleet exists because sanctions now operate at the paper layer, while trade has migrated to the physical layer. This is the defining feature of stage 4 systems. Sanctions assume 3 conditions: traceability, enforceability, and compliance. All 3 have collapsed simultaneously. Traceability fails when ownership fragments across shell entities. Enforceability fails when jurisdiction ends at the waterline. Compliance fails when demand and margins overwhelm risk. When these conditions break, rules persist only as declarations. Oil exposes this failure faster than any commodity. Energy is not discretionary. It cannot be replaced by messaging, policy statements, or moral alignment. It must move. When sanctions attempt to interrupt that movement without offering a substitute, the system routes around them automatically. The ghost fleet is not a workaround, it is the default response. The trap is assuming enforcement scales with regulation. It does not. Every new rule adds paperwork. Paperwork adds friction. Friction increases margins for those willing to bypass it. That margin funds better logistics, deeper obfuscation, and stronger private guarantees. The more aggressive the sanctions, the more profitable evasion becomes. This is the inverse of control. Western policymakers mistake visibility for effectiveness. Lists grow longer. Restrictions multiply. Insurance bans expand. Yet enforcement capacity remains finite. Navies cannot inspect every tanker. Courts cannot pierce every shell company. Regulators cannot police jurisdictions that do not cooperate. Control weakens as complexity grows. This is why the ghost fleet is expanding, not shrinking. Old vessels, written off by major insurers, are repurposed. They operate outside Western legal frameworks. Risk is priced privately. Losses are absorbed because margins allow it. The fleet grows because the economics demand it. The deeper trap is reputational. Sanctions require legitimacy to function. Once they are widely bypassed, legitimacy erodes. Allies begin to hedge. Neutral states exploit arbitrage. Enforcement becomes selective to avoid escalation. The system continues publicly while unraveling privately. This mirrors Napoleon's dilemma exactly. He maintained the continental system long after it failed because abandoning it would admit loss of control. Modern sanctions persist for the same reason. They are no longer tools to stop trade. They are signals meant to reassure domestic audiences. Meanwhile, physical trade settles reality elsewhere. Oil leaves Russian ports. It moves through invisible fleets. It is refined in third countries. It returns to Western markets under compliant labels. Consumers receive energy. Industry continues operating. Official narratives remain intact. Only the accounting changes. This is why the ghost fleet defeated sanctions without firing a shot. No confrontation was required because confrontation is no longer the enforcement mechanism. Logistics is. Once trade routes decentralize and ownership fragments, power cannot be reasserted without direct force. That option is politically and economically unacceptable. So the system adapts by pretending control still exists. This is the trap the West is now inside. Sanctions did not fail suddenly. They failed structurally. They failed the moment enforcement costs exceeded tolerance and evasion became systemic. From that point forward, reversal became mathematically impossible without dismantling global trade itself. The public misunderstands this because the lights stay on and markets continue functioning, but that continuity is deceptive. It is being maintained by parallel systems operating outside formal control. Paper says one thing, ships do another. This is paper versus physical resolving in real time. Sanctions survive as language. Trade survives as infrastructure. And infrastructure always wins. Resolution. Reset. Paper versus physical. This is not a failure of enforcement. It is a failure of assumption. Sanctions were built on the belief that paper control could override physical necessity. That belief no longer holds. Once trade migrates from the regulated layer to the logistical layer, authority loses settlement power. The ghost fleet is the visible proof. This is stage 4. In stage 4 systems, rules remain intact while outcomes detach. Declarations continue. Lists expand. Penalties exist. But compliance becomes optional because the physical network no longer depends on permission. Energy moves because it must. Profit organizes movement faster than policy can restrict it. This is paper versus physical resolving. Paper power relies on registries, insurers, flags, and legal definitions. Physical power relies on ships, ports, refineries, and demand. When the two conflict, paper retreats without negotiation, not because it is weak, but because it cannot impose itself without escalation that destroys the system enforcing it. The $4 million barrels per day did not defy sanctions. They exposed them. Once exposure occurs, reversal becomes mathematically impossible. You cannot re-centralize trade that has already decentralized without breaking global supply chains. You cannot restore legitimacy once evasion is normalized. This is why no shots were fired. The defeat occurred at the structural level. Sanctions persist as narrative. Trade persists as reality. And history resolves these moments the same way every time. Not through collapse, but through quiet transfer of control, from rules to roots. The transfer has already happened.